Welcome back to Church Without Walls. I'm John,
And I'm Payton.
and we have a new Payton cam this morning, which is right there with her own crawl. Did you see that?
Mm-hmm.
So, what to do now? Well, my wife inspired this morning talk. It's probably going to be brief. I say that every week, but something I've been learning about lately is I'm going to introduce to you just really briefly, and that is spiral dynamics. Some of you probably already know this if you studied human psychology or anthropology. It's a theory about how humans develop not just personally as we go through our stages of growth from, a baby to an adult, but also how nations or groups or civilizations or epochs, if that's how you say it, can grow in their state of consciousness towards themselves and one another, neighbors, and so forth. And so today I'm going to introduce to you how spiral dynamics can make you a better Christian after this. So, are you ready, Poe?
Yep.
Okay. I'm John Kirkwood. This is the Church Without Walls. We developed that name before COVID. We developed this setting before the pandemic, before people were told to stay home from church to protect others. I know there are people that are still going to church, and that's a personal choice. I kind of agree with Denise Murphy-Plichta, the theologian / epidemiologist, who said, I wouldn't want to risk my neighbor's health until I'm vaccinated. I won't go back to church, but that's me, and I don't want to force my opinion on you. But Church Without Walls is for people not just who are staying home because of the pandemic, but because maybe they don't feel at home at church. Or maybe they realize that church isn't a building, that church isn't a where and a when, but, kind of a who and a what. And so we're also not really a church in the sense that I don't open in prayer and we don't have songs. We may have songs in the future, but we might grab a ukulele off the rack in the back and bring you something eventually, right, Poe?
Mm-hmm.
But we're not the typical.
We're actually writing a song, right, Dad?
We are writing a few songs, yeah. So anyway, that might come in the future, but we're not the typical church service with prayer. We don't dress up. We do communion once in a while, right? We've done communion on the show, but we welcome all those who come in peace, and that doesn't mean just people who identify as Christians. Whatever you identify with, this isn't a show that gives answers. This is a show that poses questions, and these questions are meant to challenge. They're meant to be difficult for whatever you identify as, whether you identify as a believer and a follower in Jesus Christ. There are tough questions for us that we really need to grapple with as we communicate our faith and our hope to those outside of it. And then there are difficult questions for those who have maybe walked away from the faith or rejected Jesus Christ as some kind of an answer, or rejected religion at all, or as a whole, and cling to some kind of other paradigm. So we're going to ask these difficult questions, many of which we still wrestle with, right, Pay? It's okay to wrestle with stuff and even to entertain doubt in a healthy manner, because that's how progress is made. So we like to say we've walked out of Plato's cave, and when you walk out of a cave and darkness and comfort and something you've known all your life, and you walk into the stark daylight. At first, it's uncomfortable because it's new, it's different. The sun is hard for your eyes to adjust to. But once you become adjusted to the new setting, then you start to take in the beauty. Your senses have adjusted to this new setting, and you start to realize life outside the cave is pretty diverse and pretty spectacular and pretty awesome. And this was Plato's way of saying that we weren't meant to stay in our mother's womb, right? And as wonderful as our mother's womb was, as far as, room service and comfort and nap time and all that, it's just we outgrow it and we're meant to leave. The caterpillar or the butterfly or the moth wasn't meant to stay in the larva stage or in the pre-wing stage. And so once we develop wings, it's really hard to go back to the previous stage and try and communicate the wonder and the amazement that we're seeing. And it's very frustrating to people sometimes. So my answer to that is don't. That would be Paul's answer to that. Paul said, be ready to give every man an answer who asks. Who asks? He didn't say go pound on their door and force the question, as we used to do in our Baptist church when I was little, and we had visitation. And we went around visiting the pagan neighbors and trying to proselytize them by banging on their door and doing some poor, picture Ray Comfort on the street. Have you ever sinned? Oh, you're a sin. Have you ever lied? You're a liar. Have you ever looked at a woman and lost? You're an adulterer. That kind of thing. That song and dance that passes off as the gospel, which is really just a ghost story that some warped Christians still tell. However, that wasn't in the goal today. Wendy said today, why don't you talk about how God uses all kinds of people to encourage others and inspire others and bring them into understanding and love. And so I'm going to tell a story that I normally have told in church settings in the past, and it's maybe one you're familiar with, maybe not, but it has to do with two of my favorite authors, and that's C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. But before I jump into that story, I mentioned spiral dynamics to you. If you're not aware of spiral dynamics, it's a theory that's pretty much based on data and fact and human progress and history. And so it's well-rooted, and it's been developed by Dr. Claire Evans and others. But recently I heard, and brace yourselves, put on your hard hat and your seatbelt, because I'm going to say the name that should never be named in evangelical circles, because he's been outed as a heretic, and wears the scarlet letter A, and he's been virtually and metaphorically stoned over and over by the gatekeepers of evangelical truth, and that is Rob Bell. But Rob Bell has a podcast called the Robcast, and the latest two podcasts, and I would encourage you to go listen to them. Yes, I dare to say, broaden your horizons outside of your accepted reading. That's cult-like, and weigh it and see if it's worthy or if you find it objectionable. But in his latest two podcasts, he talks about spiral dynamics as it's related to human growth and evolution, and he does so with his son. And one of the things I love about it is these two generations, and you could tell there's a mutual love for each other and respect, and they both have knowledge of the subject, and so they're walking you through spiral dynamics. And spiral dynamics really explains why you have people in your life that won't wear a mask, or that voted red and not blue, or blue and not red. It kind of explains why people do what they do, what kind of paradigm they're caught up in, and where they are progressively in human growth, and how that influences them both religiously and politically and even personally. And so if you're wondering why these things happen and seem out of place, or why they seem so predictable in some cases, spiral dynamics helps you look at that. And so I'm just going to give you a taste of it right now. And that is just, if you imagine a child that's born and that grows up, that child goes through different stages of growth. And each stage is special, but when a boy is 16, if he retains you know the exact traits of when he was 6 years old, something's wrong, right? His growth has been stunted, you know, and he's living in some kind of Neverland experience, and it might be some kind of a biological disorder or something else. But we all notice that something's wrong. The Apostle Paul actually, in his letter to the Corinthians, used that as an example, you know, of an older person who still wants to be, how do I put this? Wants to nurse with his mother, right? How awkward that is. It's so awkward that Jim Carrey had it in one of his movies, right? Where, now I'm taking you into a dark place, but it was a funny movie. But we can all imagine the sight of like a grown man trying to suckle his mother's teat. Not a really good image that wash your brain of that right now, but that's the image, right? We see a 6-year-old or maybe a toddler or even an infant as cute in their stage, but when they advance to other stages and they, for example, a 12-year-old who still sucks his thumb, not cute anymore, right? It's concerning. There's something wrong there. Growth has been stunted. We want to try and maybe intercede for that person if we're in their family, to try and help them grow past a certain roadblock that maybe is an obstacle to their growth, that kind of thing. So spiral dynamics kind of talks about this. And it doesn't say that one stage is better than another, because they're all necessary stages, right? The toddler stage is necessary for the infant John to become the adult John. It was necessary that I went through that stage. And so if you understand it in this way, you won't get judgmental when you realize that some people you meet in life haven't progressed to advanced stages of human growth. And we're all on different stages, and in some cases we might think like an adult in some areas and like a toddler in others. So keep in mind this stage. But when a child is first born, he's egocentric, and this is the first stage. It's me, right? It's about me, and part of that is understandable, right? Because your needs cannot be met by yourself. So you rely on others to meet your needs, and so you're kind of desperate for, you know, food and a comfortable diaper and enough rest and all that. And so you're very me focused and me centered and egocentric. And as you grow, you realize you're part of a family or a tribe or a community that has certain rules and codes and, you know, assets and liabilities and blessings and cursings and do's and don'ts. And you find out you're part of a group, and you go from being egocentric, or at least if you're growing, you go from being egocentric to being ethnocentric. And I use that term not to say that you're just bound by a certain ethnicity. I'm not just, you could be by a certain culture or a certain time that you're set in, but it could be, this is where you find out, you know, you're an Irish Catholic living in Boston, which makes you a Democrat. You know, that's the very ethnocentricity kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, not every person born in Boston is going to be an Irish Catholic Democrat, and some of them are going to be the black sheep of their families and grow beyond that and move beyond that. But this is that kind of stage, the ethnocentricity stage, where you find out who you are in your group and so forth, and what's acceptable and not. And so the second stage of like this human progress is from egocentricity to ethnocentricity. And then when you move beyond that, you realize it's a big world, and that there are more stories than the ones your tribe tells around the fire in Plato's cave, and you venture outside of that, and you realize that there's actual beauty where you were told was only cursing and lies or something else. And you realize that the world is bigger than your village or your family or your denomination or your religion or your political views. And you know, maybe it's travel that has done this for you. Maybe you've traveled further, or you've come into contact with people who don't share your faith or your politics, and you accept them for who they are, and you see the beauty in them, you see the value in them, and in hearing their stories. And they have different stories than you and different myths that are dear to them. And you realize that there's relevance there too. And this brings you to a growth, I'll call it geocentricity, right? So we move from egocentricity to ethnocentricity. And as we really grow and mature, we have this kind of a geocentric view where we can appreciate the world around us is various and diverse and still has beauty in different ways. You know, people might sing different and pray different and worship different and may eat different foods and have different superheroes, and yet we all see elements of truth and beauty and good there, and realize that humanity is bigger than our Southern Baptist youth group. I need a drink. Let's go to Payton Cam as I take a drink. How's that? All right, give me a break. Payton, I don't see a lot of production here. I'm going to be interested to see what you come up with, because I basically just see a pair of scissors and some construction paper. So I'm assuming you've got a plan. You've got a plan. We'll see.
I'm actually coloring the third part of my plan right now.
Okay. Where were we? So that's basically a general understanding of spiral dynamics. Obviously, there's books you can get and videos you can watch and TED Talks and so forth, and weigh the theory and see if it makes sense to you. But it's based on history and data, and it has a firm foundation to understand it. And then you'll find out that they use colors. It's kind of a spiral cyclone that goes up, of progress up, and beige is like at the very bottom, and that's very kind of the primal stage where we're meeting our own needs, and that's all we care about. And that would be a stage if you were dropped on a desert island and all of a sudden your worries completely changed, because now you have to worry more about food and shelter and where the next meal is going to come from and so forth. And you're starting from scratch, and you'd be in a very beige stage even if you'd advanced all the way up to turquoise or whatever. But you're going to find out, if you study spiral dynamics, why your Uncle Hank watches Fox News 24 hours a day and is obsessed by politics and really believes that, you know, anyone who didn't vote the way he voted is like of the devil. I mean, it'll help you understand Uncle Hank, because he's in a very blue place, and if you study spiral dynamics, you'll know what that means. But moving beyond that, how does this help us become a better Christian? Well, some of us have progressed through these stages without even knowing they exist. We couldn't put a language to it. We couldn't articulate it. But we've seen it. And maybe if you're a Christian, you've seen that person, and you've said to yourself, wow, they're really spiritually mature, right? Or maybe you've said, I really see God in them, or I could really see the reflection of Christ in their demeanor and their behavior and how welcoming they are of others. My mother was a person like this. She made an impact on everyone she met. And I know it sounds like I'm blowing my own horn in this case. I know there's other Christians out there that kind of, you see Jesus in them, Teresa of Calcutta, others. But in my circle, it was my mother. She really made an impact on a lot of people, even people who thought differently than her. She wasn't a person who put doctrine over the important things. She put people. She understood what it was like to be that lost sheep, and to be without a brother or father in the world, right? So when you meet people like that, you don't maybe have the language to categorize them as far as spiral dynamics goes, but you have some language to say, oh yeah, I see Jesus in that person, or the spirit really leads them. You know, they're really spirit led. They really have. I would aspire, you know, to be like them, and this is why, you know, you see Paul telling the younglings in the churches he planted, you know, follow me as I follow Christ. You know, follow in my steps in the snow, because they're going to lead you in the right way. You know, as you've seen me make decisions, and as you've seen me react and act, you know, those are a good guide for you, you know, as a spiritual father would say to his children. Now, we can't always say that. I say to my kids all the time, I really screwed up there. Don't follow me in that area. But here's what I've learned from it. So I hope, you know, we have the humility to do that. I hope you do. And I'm sure you probably do it better than I, but that's where we need to be. The Holy Spirit humbles us first before he can do anything with us. One of I brought up two of my favorite authors. This is a story I love to tell. But before I tell it, I want to talk to you about Francis Collins. No, you know, I'll tell you about Francis Collins at the end, because he kind of fits in with this story. But first, I want to tell you about a young boy born in Africa. He was from a wealthy British family. His father was a banker, and he was born at a very what kind of time was it? Late 19th century. A British aristocrat in South Africa. His father had taken the family there as a banker. And not long after that, his father died, leaving his mother a widow of two young boys. Now, there was a problem here, because I said they came from two wealthy families. This young couple that got married, they both came from wealthy families. But something happened. What happened? The young man, who was a Protestant, decided that the Catholic Church was the one true church. And he convinced his wife that this was true. So his wife converted to Catholicism at a time where, well, this was scandalous, right, for Protestant people. So when this happened, the families cut them off. And when the father died, provision for the family died. So they became destitute really overnight. Their families, the families of her late husband and her own family, had already disowned them. And so she had nothing. So she went from having, you know, privilege and position to being a widow of two young boys and really scraping to make it. And she was helped by a local priest. And then something else happened. Then she dies. She gets sick and dies. The boys are still very young, you know, before their teens. And the mother dies. And now they end up being raised by a Catholic priest. And they grew up in their formative years, in their family history, hearing the stories of how they were abandoned by their families because their parents had the courage to embrace truth over, you know, Plato's cave, that tribe they grew up in that accepted certain things and cursed other things. And it takes courage to walk away from the family mythos. And not only did their father did it, their mother did it. And so, like many children who've lost their parents at a young age, they idolize their parents. And I would say in this case, rightly so. I think they had great parents. But these two young boys grew up in the care of a Catholic priest who was kind and loving to them. And the only real parent they knew in their very formative years. And what they knew of their real parents was a story of great courage, that they were willing to forsake wealth and even family acceptance to pursue the truth. So these boys grew up in that environment, and you ask yourself, how could they not be Catholic in that environment? Their parents forsook everything to embrace Catholicism, and when they really were in need, what happened? Who came to their rescue? Was it blood? No. Their own blood rejected them, made them outcasts, orphans, in their greatest time of need. It wasn't family. It wasn't tradition that helped them. It was a priest of the dread religion that their parents embraced as true. So what did they learn at a very young age? Well, love can be found here. And truth can be found here. And so they were born into a tradition that they accepted as courageous and true. Now, I've seen this happen time and time again in the pro-life movement, where people who are working, maybe they're even atheists, and they're working in Planned Parenthood or in the pro-choice movement, and all of a sudden they have a religious experience and come out of that movement, and they end up converting to Catholicism. Bernard Nathanson, who was an atheist of Jewish background, converted to Catholicism. And so did Norma McCorvey, who, when she converted to Christianity, first became a Baptist because of her relationship with Flip Benham, but then eventually converted to Catholicism. And Abby Johnson, the same thing, converted to Catholicism. And all my Protestant pro-life friends are like, why is this happening? And I simply tell them, to their shame, to our shame, I guess you could call me a Protestant, although I don't go by those labels. But I would tell them, to our own shame, that's where they see the love. That's where they see the acceptance and the encouragement, and that's where they see Jesus, is with these Catholic, loving people who prayed with them in their lowest moments and in their moments of vulnerability, and who came to them and loved them and embraced them. So I'm not surprised that Abby and Bernard and Norma embraced Catholicism, because Catholicism embraced them. So anyway, back to these two young boys. Well, they're raised by a Catholic priest, and they grow up in that environment. And if you haven't guessed already, one of these young boys was named John Roald Rule Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. This is Tolkien's background. And this is the background that met a young atheist professor who had some shared interests with him at Oxford in the early 20th century. And on a walk with an Anglican named Hugo Dyson, who happened to be a friend, and an atheist named C.S. Lewis, who happened to be a friend, J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, two different religious denominations, were working on this atheist. And they talked to him till Dyson even later than Tolkien, but till about 3 or 4 in the morning on this famous walk, Addison's Walk, where the subject of religion and myth came up, and truth. And this is where the scales fell from Lewis's eyes. And really hours after this moment, he became a theist, not a Christian, but a theist. And it was Tolkien who convinced him that maybe he was narrow-minded about this, and maybe he should be open to the idea that Jesus Christ was the true myth, right? So here, God uses an Anglican and a Catholic to lead C.S. Lewis to theism and eventually Christianity. Now, Lewis gives credit to a number of people for the path that he went on that led him to his relationship, or his reconciliation, if you will, because he grew up Anglican and then rejected the faith as a young boy because his mother died. And he had been told some bad doctrine by the Anglican vicars that, if he prayed hard enough, his mother would live. And then when his mother didn't live, like many young boys, he thought this whole thing is rubbish, much like the Hitchens boys, and who didn't go through the mother's death, but went through family trauma. And Lewis rejected God and theism. And here, after this walk with this Anglican and this Catholic, he was open to it and eventually embraced it. Now, Lewis writes, and he says that the men who influenced him the most on this journey, it was particularly Dyson and Tolkien on that walk at Addison's Walk, but he had been prepared for that moment by reading another Catholic named G.K. Chesterton and another Protestant named George MacDonald. Oh, I mentioned another no-no word, George MacDonald, who people reject as a heretic because of his universalism, his rejection of, eternal conscious torment and that kind of thing. But it was these two men, Chesterton and MacDonald, who had prepared the field, who had tilled the field for the seed and the water that were applied by Tolkien and Dyson. So what do we have here? Well, we've got two Catholics and two Protestants who worked on an atheist, who argued with an atheist, who presented their hope to an atheist. And that atheist eventually comes to a belief, an acceptance of Jesus Christ. And he tips his hat to these people. Now, many people wondered why C.S. Lewis didn't convert to Catholicism, because after all, Catholics played such a crucial role in bringing him to the faith. And Tolkien joked about this once. Tolkien said, well, Lewis rejected Catholicism because he had ulterior motives. Not ulterior motives, but ulterior motives. Because Lewis was born in Ulster, in Ireland, and so that made him a Protestant, and that made him see a very ugly side of Catholicism, a Molotov cocktail side of Catholicism in his birthplace. And so Tolkien basically says that the block to Lewis becoming a Catholic was that he grew up in that environment. See, you look at Tolkien's environment, you almost say, how could he not be a Catholic? Because Catholicism to him was love and acceptance and nourishment. But Catholicism to Lewis was terrorism and narrow-mindedness and political slogans and ugliness. And yet he didn't see that, and he saw through all that in his friendship with Tolkien and in his appreciation of the intellect of Chesterton. He was able to see beyond a lot of things, but when it came down to it, he just couldn't become a Catholic because probably of the shrapnel and the gunpowder of his youth. I don't know. Ulterior motives. But it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me why Tolkien was a Catholic. And if I had ever met him, I would never try and talk him out of it. Why would I? Because God uses Catholics. And God used the Catholic. I'll tell you something stunning. God doesn't just use people of faith. He uses atheists. He inspires atheists, even though they'd never admit it. And atheists actually do his bidding with others, leading them to the truth. I've said on a number of occasions, when the honest skeptic, who identifies as an atheist or not, agnostic, what have you, when an honest skeptic is in pursuit of the truth, well, as a Christian who believes that God is veracity, that God is truth, that atheist, blindfold on, whatever, blinders, that atheist is pursuing God. Whether it's in a laboratory or in a microscope or a telescope or in a philosophy class, if that honest skeptic is pursuing truth, even if it's leaving a church, even if you're a nun and you grew up in a church that, forgive me, had some truth in it, but was robed in nonsense and foolishness and hatred and bitterness and ugliness. That atheist who's rejecting that church and that God is actually closer to the truth from leaving that church than he was when he was sitting there in that stew of boiling half-truth. And so, yeah, don't cry for me, Argentina, if you're the mother of one of those kids and he grew up in toxic Christianity and he's left it. Because as C.S. Lewis pointed out, if you're at the base of a mountain and your home is a mile up that mountain, but you can't get there from a straight line, you're actually closer to home when you walk away from that village to wind up the mountain and eventually get there. You're actually closer to being home when you walk further away from it in that condition. And think of that metaphor in light. Payton, Cam, think of that metaphor in light of people who have walked away from the faith. They're not gone in God's eyes. His eye is on the sparrow. He's going after the lost sheep. He'd like you to do it because God works through his people. So he'd like us to do it. That's the reason Wendy and I have called this ministry the Sparrow's Call. But, so don't be too upset when somebody leaves toxic Christianity and is on a journey to the truth. Because if you're comfortable and confident that God is real and that God is truth and that God is love, they're on a path that is closer to him than when they were sitting in that, I don't know, I always pick on the Southern Baptists, but what have you, Protestant, Catholic Church, what have you. So here we have this story of Tolkien, a Catholic, helping Lewis, an Anglican, that come to the faith. Now, Lewis was by far, and I know some people think it was Billy Graham. It isn't. It's C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis by far was the most influential evangelist of the 20th century, and I will go so far to say is he's the most influential evangelist of the 21st century. Because, he died in 1963 on the day that Aldous Huxley and Jack Kennedy died. His work lives on, and his work is still best-selling, and his work still transforms the lives of people. And I'll give you the example now in the shape of Francis Collins, one of the world's greatest scientists. He's the one who led the Human Genome Project, which basically mapped out all of the human genome, DNA. He's leading the fight against COVID. Anthony Fauci works for him at the National Institutes of Health. And he's also a devout Christian. But when he was an intern, when he was in an internship in North Carolina, he worked in a hospital where he was around the dying quite a bit. And people in hospice. And he, for the first time in his life, even though he kind of grew up in a religious background, really just to appreciate music in church, he was an atheist. And he met these people, simple people from North Carolina, who, and I don't mean all people from North Carolina are simple, but you know what I'm saying. They weren't PhDs. These were just simple people who were at their end of their lives in the hospital, and he as a doctor was meeting them. And he was amazed at how peaceful they were, even knowing they had just but hours or days to live. And at one point, in a conversation with a woman who was dying, the subject of God came up. And he asked her, he said, "How are you so at peace? It's remarkable that your demeanor is just so calm and accepting of your condition." And she said, "Because I have hope in Jesus." And she said to him, "What do you believe, doctor?" And that simple question stunned him, because he hadn't given it much thought. He was an atheist. He thought it was a bunch of, malarkey and baloney. And yet he saw something in these people that he wanted to have himself. Something that was remarkable to him, something that was mysterious to him. And he didn't know. He didn't have an answer for her because he had never thought it out. And he thought to himself, how silly is that of a man of science, who investigates things, to have never investigated this? I've investigated many things in the physical, natural world, but I haven't really given a fair shot to the metaphysical, supernatural possibilities. And like anyone else, he sought out an expert because he believes in expertise. He, went through college and he understands as a man of science that there's a method to finding truth and pursuing evidence. And so he sought out an expert. And the closest expert he knew of was a Methodist minister who lived by him. And so he went to this Methodist minister's house with a list of questions, and he started to grill him. He said, how can you answer this? And I don't know what the questions were, but they were probably typical of many skeptics who come from a science background and who rejects Christianity as kind of like fairy stories. Might have asked about Noah's Ark or how Cain got his wife. Who knows? Or do you really believe that Jesus turned water into wine or walked on the water? Who knows? But he asked this Methodist minister these questions. And here's something that I love about this Methodist minister. He had the humility to realize that he was out of his depth. He knew by the nature of these questions that this was an intellectual he was dealing with who probably wouldn't be satisfied with the Sunday school answers he had prepared. But he had somebody on his shelf that he wanted to introduce him to. He said, listen, I can tell that you're an intellectual and these questions are serious and meaningful to you. And, well, I think I could fairly give you a good answer. I want to introduce you to somebody who has a similar background as yours as far as education goes, and I think will satisfy your curiosity on a greater level. And he handed him the book, Mere Christianity. I want to stop here for a commercial break and say to you that there's a book written by an acquaintance of mine called Mere Christians. Mere Christians. And it tells the story of all these people who read Mere Christianity and went from atheism to Christianity simply by reading that book and looking at the arguments in it that C.S. Lewis presents, which I think it's the greatest. I think it's still the greatest evangelical apologetics book written. And it actually started, I don't know if you know this, as a series of radio addresses during World War II. And the BBC actually went to C.S. Lewis and said, would you do this during this time of great need for the British people who are at war with the Nazis? And so he wrote these radio addresses and gave short 15-minute addresses on the BBC every day. And then later these were compiled into the book Mere Christianity. And this pastor gave this book to Francis Collins, who read the book and was in awe at the intellectual and the vigor and the robust arguments of what he had dismissed as a silly superstition. And of course he comes to Christ and his life changed. And he's still a great scientist. He's founded Biologos, which is a place where people can realize that you can believe in modern science and still be a Christian. You don't have to believe that the earth is 6,000 years old and that Noah bunked with T-Rex on a boat, what was it, 2,500 years ago or whatever, to be a Christian. You could believe that, there's a place for people who accept evolutionary theory and believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and that those things aren't in conflict. So he starts this group called Biologos, which I recommend to you. But here, I want you to follow the trail of this. Right? A South African, I'm going to call him South African, a South African Catholic, and J.R.R. Tolkien helps lead C.S. Lewis, an Anglican to the Lord, who writes a book and lives a life and creates work, not as an Anglican, but as a mere Christian, and reaches all kinds of people. All kinds of Christians appreciate C.S. Lewis, and even non-Christians. And he reaches all kinds of people and leads them to Christ. And one of them was named Francis Collins. Now, Francis Collins founds BioLogos, which is a place to say that you can believe in evolutionary theory and Jesus Christ, and you're welcome at the Lord's table, right? You're not an outcast, you're not a heretic, you're not a fool. But I want you to think back to that North Carolina hospice room. The odds are that the woman who asked Francis Collins that question, "What do you believe, doctor?" The odds are that she did believe the earth was only 6,000 years old. The odds are that she did believe that Noah had a boat filled with all the animals, 2 of each kind and 7 of each kind. The odds are that that woman believed all that, and yet God used her and the understanding in which she had to lead this atheist named Francis Collins. And he used a United Methodist minister and C.S. Lewis to lead this atheist to the Lord. And now Francis Collins has written a book that's much like Mere Christianity called The Language of God. And it's reaching a whole different group of people, a group of people that were interested in Christ and yet had to reject it because it just didn't, they knew modern science was true, you know. They are PhDs in biology or geology or paleontology or embryology or plate tectonics. And they know that what they grew up hearing in their Sunday school was like crazy, right? And so he writes this book, The Language of God, which the first half gives his testimony, what I just shared with you. And the second half argues that you don't have to reject modern science to accept, you know, ancient Christianity, ancient Judaism and Christianity and the text or the Bible. And so this is how God uses people. And this is why we should be more open, more geocentric in our understanding if we're talking about spiral dynamics, and not egocentric or ethnocentric. This is why we should leave Plato's cave and have dinner with Christians of other backgrounds and even non-Christians, because God uses all his children, whether they know it or not. And you see this in the Bible. You see this with the high priest who prophesied. The Holy Spirit worked through an unbelieving high priest, and he prophesied. So, yeah, God can use a jackass, as he did in the Old Testament, and he uses all kinds of people, including you and I, some of us outcasts, some of us the offscouring of the earth. Some of us are objectionable. Some of us might not reach the high and the mighty or the royal, and yet God wants to reach all his lost sheep. And so he appeals to all to be his messengers. So I would argue for you to open up your mind to understand this, that spiral dynamics could be seen in something as ancient as the biblical text. And it's readily seen in the life and the demeanor of those Christians who have grown to an area of spiritual maturity where they realize that their village story isn't the only one. Their particular denomination or ism doesn't have the corner on all knowledge. As Job said to his friends, you guys think that when you die, knowledge will die with you. I'm going to leave you with the story my father used to tell, a joke really, and then we're going to go to Payton Camp and see where we're at as far as Payton's weekly project. But I want to start with a story my father told, kind of about how religions and isms can be so narrow sometimes. And the story is told of a man who dies. And of course, he goes to heaven. This man's redeemed, and he meets St. Peter at the pearly gates. And Peter is going to give him a tour of heaven. And he's taking him through a tour, and it's a beautiful place. And first, he goes down by a riverside, and he introduces this newbie, if you would, to a group of people who are having a party down by the river, and they're singing and they're shouting and they're doing cartwheels, and they're very animated and emotional. And these are the charismatics, right? These are the Pentecostals, and they're just having a ball. They're tearing it up. down by the riverside. And then they move a little bit inland and they come to a park area, and it looks like there's a pancake breakfast happening. And this newbie sees a man dressed rather awkwardly in khaki shorts and black socks and sandals. And this is, of course, the Baptists, and that's the Baptist pastor at the pancake breakfast that the Baptists are having. And there's no alcohol there, but there's some really good lemonade and, orange juice and pancakes. And they move on beyond that, and then they find another party, and there's a keg there, and there's wine and all kinds of things. And then this, of course, is the Catholics, and then the Anglicans, and he moves through all this. But then they finally get to this tower, and looks like something out of Harry Potter, maybe. It's like an old castle, and it's looking its age. Right? And Peter takes him to a winding staircase, an inner staircase that goes all the way up this high tower. And they start walking up these stone steps, and there's cobwebs and dust, which is odd for this newbie. He didn't think there would be, spiders and dust in heaven, but there were. There's cobwebs and dust, and the floor, was cracked. The concrete was cracked in some areas, and there was even parts of it that were wooden treads, and those treads were creaky. And they finally get near the top, and they see this big wooden oak door, right? And Peter turns around at that point, and he says, "Shh." And they go up to the door, and Peter doesn't open the door, but he just brings it back far enough, and it creaks a little bit. But he brings it back far enough that both men could peek their heads around the door and see what's happening inside it. And what happens inside, the view, is of 3 or 4 old men with beards. Looks like, Gandalf or what's the Harry Potter guy?
Dumbledore.
Dumbledore and Gandalf are poring over these ancient scrolls, right? They're looking and they're discussing these ancient scrolls. And the newbie's like shocked, and Peter turns around and he said, "And these are the Plymouth Brethren. Don't disturb them because they think they're the only ones here." They're the only ones here. Yes, and that joke is funny because it's so true of some of the groups we've grown up with. Calvinists think that. Dispensationalists think that. I could give you group after group. Some Catholics believe that, right? Some Protestants believe that. You could plug group after group in here, and they're still thinking ethnocentrically. They never got to the grand idea of what the body of Christ is made up of. That the hand can't say to the eye, "I have no need of thee." That the Catholic can't say to the Anglican, "I have no need of thee," because we've seen the need of the Catholic in the life of C.S. Lewis, and we've seen the need of the former atheist, happens to be Anglican, mere Christian, in the life of Francis Collins. I wonder who's in your spiritual family tree. Mine goes back through my father to a guy named Billy Graham. And Billy Graham goes back to a Sunday school teacher who happened to sell shoes. He was a shoe salesman. And who led that guy to the Lord? I don't know, but there's a long train of people who had inspired others. And I imagine much like Christ's genealogy, if you look at the genealogy of Jesus Christ in either gospel, you know what you find there? Murderers, adulteresses. You find prostitutes in the line of Christ. And I imagine that in your spiritual line of faith, we've got the occasional horse thief and the occasional madam of a brothel. Yes? So be humble and be kind and be thoughtful and be open. And be like Christ. I know that last one made you fall off your chair because you and I both know we can't. But we can. We just can't all the time because we're mortal. And we're still dependent on our own volition. And the humble realization that we need the Holy Spirit to guide us and lead us and to inspire us and to convict us. All right. That's all I've got for this Sunday. Are you ready, Poe? Let me see. I still see nothing.
I'm ready.
I still see nothing ready in this hodgepodge of construction paper debris. But are you ready? Should I?
Yes.
Okay, you're ready. Which camera do you want to use?
You could use the main one, and I'll hold it up.
Main camera. Bang.
So this is Miss Princess.
This is Miss Princess, folks.
She's wearing a princess dress.
She's wearing a princess dress. What's her name?
Miss Princess.
Miss Princess. Really creative name.
And this is Georgia Lala.
Georgia, let's use the other camera real quick because it really gives a good view. Oh, okay. So that's Georgia. So Georgia gets a name.
Georgia Lala.
Georgia Lala gets a name. Miss Princess doesn't get a name, but I'll tell you what, she's got a kind face. She looks like she needs to do some Pilates, though. She's kind of filling out that dress. Maybe a little bit big boned. Is that too judgmental? I'm just saying.
And
All right.
this is the prince. He's wearing a suit and a tie.
I like that. Well, yeah. Okay, then. I like that. I like the
That's
prince.
a little pocket right there.
So is Georgia their daughter or just like some local peasant girl?
Their daughter, Dad.
Oh, the daughter. Okay.
And the prince's name is Mr. Suit.
The prince has a name, Mr. Suit, but the princess with no name is kind of interesting. Oh.
And this is their book. It's called Cats and Dogs. They always are reading it. And when you open it up, there's a dog and there's a gray cat. And they read it all the time because they like reading about the gray cat and the dog.
They read that to Georgia Lala?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I love it, Poe, except it's kind of messy. It's kind of messy. But Georgia Lala and The Princess with No Name, that could be a good book, The Princess with No Name. That could be a good children's book.
We're already writing 5 books, but we could have 6.
Yes. Well, we got to finish one before technically we're authors. But all right. Folks, I hope that was meaningful to you. I would encourage you to check out the Robcast, the last 2 he does with his son, Trace. I just love the way they interact. Plus, it's good information, and it might give you a primer of spiral dynamics, which will only help your understanding of your fellow man. It will make you a better Christian. Love and peace. We'll see you next week.